They left me at the shelter and said, "If you want to die, die here." That was the last sentence my son ever gave me, without pretending it was wrapped in concern, and it landed with the quiet finality of a door that has been closed for years. Before you notice, it was never meant to open again. I remember the way his voice dipped, barely audible, as if shame had weight and he didn't want to be seen carrying it. I stood there on the cracked pavement with my overnight bag, an old canvas thing that still smelled faintly of cedar, and looked at the two people who had once called me their center, their help, their safety net, their reliable, invisible scaffolding. He wouldn't even meet my eyes, and she kept her sunglasses on, though the sun was setting. She had always been afraid of witnessing consequences, even tiny ones, like catching sight of a homeless man on the street, or of me when I was sick. The door of their car shut before I even managed to close my fingers around the strap of my bag, and I watched the taillights flicker away like small red lies disappearing into the dusk. They didn't wave. They didn't slow down. They didn't look back. There are moments in a woman's life when silence becomes a verdict, and I heard mine loud and clear in the hum of their engine. I didn't shout after them. I didn't run. Old women don't chase cars. We simply stand still and let the world decide what kind of creature we are now, that our usefulness has expired. I was 82, with brittle knees, trembling fingers, and a heart that hadn't beaten from its own desires in decades. But I was not confused. I was not frail in the way they hoped I would be. I understood exactly what had happened. They had chosen my absence over their shame, chosen convenience over blood, chosen the easy narrative, she needed professional care, over the truth that I had become a burden in a world that worshipped speed, youth, and spotless living rooms where old skin and trembling hands do not fit the decor. And so they brought me here, to a building that once might have tried to pretend it was a community center, but now stood like a tired confession, with chipped bricks and a metal door that groaned like it resented every person who ever pushed it open. I stood outside longer than I should have, not because I expected anyone to come back, but because I needed to feel that moment settle fully inside me. I needed the cold air. I needed the emptiness around my feet. I needed the distant sound of the car disappearing so I could understand, without illusion, that I was alone now. Not the lovely, romantic kind of alone people write poems about, but a hollow, bureaucratic aloneness, the kind that exists on forms and intake sheets, the kind that can swallow you without intention or malice. My whole life had been spent in kitchens and living rooms, in grocery store aisles, in doctor's offices, in school auditoriums, in quiet rooms where I sat knitting while everyone else lived loudly. I had built a family the way I built sweaters, carefully, quietly, with attention to small stitches no one ever noticed. And now I was here, a disposable project, something unfinished that had become an inconvenience. Inside the shelter, the air smelled of bleach, sweat, and boiled pasta. Everything was loud. Voices, footsteps, the clatter of a metal cart someone pushed down the hall with the resigned rhythm of ritual. A woman at the front desk looked at me with a mixture of pity and detachment, the way someone looks at a package delivered to the wrong address, but too heavy to return. "You're the drop-off?" she asked, scanning the empty doorway behind me, as if expecting someone else. I nodded. Words felt unnecessary. She asked for my name, my age, my medical conditions, the name of my emergency contact. I gave her everything except the last question, because the answer had driven away 10 minutes earlier. She told me to wait on a plastic chair near the wall, the kind that squeaks under the smallest movement, as though even a chair has the right to protest holding an old woman. I sat there, hands in my lap, watching people shuffle through the corridor, a man muttering to himself about lost keys, a young girl hugging a backpack like it was her only inheritance, an older couple arguing softly about which pills had gone. Missing. No one looked at me long enough to form a judgment. We were all fragments here, all broken shapes trying to fit into a space that wasn't meant to hold anyone whole. When the staff member finally called my name, I followed her down the hallway slowly, not out of weakness, but because I wanted to see everything. The peeling posters about empowerment that no one believed, the locked medicine room where hope was, measured in milligrams, the bulletin board plastered with missing persons flyers and community notices about grief support meetings scheduled at odd hours. I remember thinking, this is where they expect me to end, not with ceremony, not with dignity, just here, quietly, invisibly, with paperwork attached. The room she assigned me was small, with 2 beds, 2 metal lockers, 1 window with bars on the outside, but not the inside, as if the building wanted to remind us that the world did not trust the broken to roam freely. One of the beds was already occupied, neatly made with crisp sheets and a folded scarf at the foot, an elegant emerald thing too refined for this place. I didn't know yet who it belonged to, but something about that scarf unsettled me. It was out of place, defiantly alive, like a green flame refusing to smother itself in this air. I set my bag on the unmade bed and sat down carefully, letting the mattress sigh under me. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. Age teaches a woman to hold her pain the way one holds a fragile box, firmly, without panic, without letting anything slip. I stared at the barred window and whispered, not to God, but to the part of myself that still believed in quiet revolutions. They think this is the end. And in that whisper, there was not grief, only the faint, unfamiliar stirrings of something that felt almost like defiance. I didn't know then that the woman who slept in the other bed would change everything, or that the emerald scarf would become the first sign that my life was not ending, but shifting into something strange and fierce and entirely my own. I only knew that I had been left to disappear, and the cruelest part was that I almost did, until she walked in, until her voice cracked through my silence, until I realized that abandonment can sometimes be the first step toward an unexpected inheritance, not of money, but of self. The catalyst of it all arrived not with a scream or a crash, but with the dry, bureaucratic tone of a woman holding a clipboard, a tone so practiced it carried the stealthy power to redraw a person's entire existence without ever raising the volume. She knocked on the door frame of my new room with the knuckles of someone who had stopped believing that anything behind a door might surprise her. And when I looked up, she gave me the polite half-smile reserved for people you expect to disappoint. "Miss Harcourt," she said, reading my name as if she were saying it for the first and final time. "I've spoken with your son." Something in her voice made the air shift, made the fluorescent light seem brighter, made the edges of the metal bed bite more sharply into the back of my thighs. She stepped in, closed the door gently behind her, and sat in the chair opposite me, crossing her legs with the smooth, efficient movement of someone who deals with fragile lives all day and refuses to let any of it seep into her posture. She explained in that quiet monotone that could have narrated a weather report that my son had signed voluntary relinquishment papers earlier that morning, that he had acknowledged an inability to provide safe housing, consistent care, or stable oversight, words so formal they sounded like accusations dressed in business attire. My breath left me slowly, not in shock, but in the deliberate way someone exhales before lifting something heavy and irreversible. She continued, telling me that the state had been notified, that temporary guardianship of my medical decisions and welfare had been transferred to the shelter's assigned social services liaison, that they would work on finding a long-term placement should my situation remain unchanged. I listened without interrupting, hands folded in my lap, every muscle inside me tight as piano wire, my gaze fixed on a crack in the wall above her shoulder. I think she expected tears or pleading or outrage. What she got instead was an old woman absorbing the final truth of her family in silence. The worst part wasn't the news itself. It was the way she tried to soften it, the way she offered me phrases like, "These things happen," and "families struggle under pressure," as though language could erase the fact that I had been methodically erased by the people I had once fed, once held, once comforted while they dreamed feverish childhood dreams. She told me they had tried calling my son again, but he didn't answer, and when she left a voicemail identifying herself, he sent a text, short, clipped, so familiar in tone it pierced deeper than the abandonment itself, saying only that the arrangement was final and he did not want further contact at this time, as if he were rescheduling a dentist appointment rather than dismantling the last remaining thread between us. After she finished her script, she placed a pamphlet on the small table beside me, one of those glossy trifolds with stock photos of elderly people smiling on park benches, the kind of smile people wear when a camera lens demands gratitude. The title read, "Adjusting to Transitional Care Environments." She said I might find it helpful, though her voice made it clear she had no real expectations about my future capacity for adjusting, surviving, or wanting anything at all. When she left, closing the door with the same careful softness she had used entering, I felt the silence swell around me in a way that was not empty, but swollen with a new, terrible clarity. I sat there for a long time, my hands still folded, my body refusing to move as if motion itself might shatter some fragile internal balance. It wasn't disbelief. I had known, somewhere deep under the many years of routines and compromises, that my son had been drifting away for a long time, trading pieces of me for the comfort of not having to face the mirror of what family asks of a man. But knowing a thing abstractly and having it presented in legal language are entirely different realities. The truth had been floating for years. Now it had weight. Now it had paperwork. Now it had a file number. I remembered a conversation we'd had years ago, long before his face hardened into the polite mask he wore around me in recent times. He had been 17, angry about some rule I'd enforced, and he'd shouted that he wanted to live in a house where nobody saw him as a responsibility. At the time, I told myself he didn't mean it, that teenagers sharpen words without precision. But that sentence slipped back into my mind then, in that bleak shelter room, and I realized maybe he had meant it more than either of us understood. Maybe he had spent decades growing into that wish, letting it calcify into a belief that I was not someone to love, but someone to manage, someone to file under tasks and burdens and obligations. The pamphlet stared at me with its smiling models, and the absurdity of it pushed something inside me dangerously close to breaking. I picked it up, held it loosely between my fingers, and nearly laughed at how small and insufficient the thing was, as though 30 years of sacrifice could be comforted by a handful of bullet points about embracing community resources. Instead of laughing, I set it back down and looked at the bed across from mine, with its perfect emerald scarf folded so gracefully it seemed to belong to another world. That was when I realized I would have a roommate, someone whose life had been twisted into this place alongside mine, someone whose existence might intersect with mine in unpredictable ways. I felt an odd flicker inside me, not hope, not yet, but the faintest recognition that the story I'd been shoved into was not finished, not fully defined by the cruelty of a single moment. The catalyst had done what catalysts do. It had changed the shape of everything, not with drama, but with the quiet inevitability of a signature on a line. I was no longer a mother or a burden or a guest overstaying her welcome. I was something else entirely, something unanchored and therefore terrifyingly free. The severing was brutal, but the air that rushed into that wound carried an unfamiliar scent, something like the beginning of a life I had never expected to meet at this age. I felt empty, yes, but emptiness is also space, and space can be filled. I didn't know yet with what: rage, grief, resilience, strange companionship, but I sensed that the world had pushed me off the cliff only to reveal that the ground beneath was not a grave, but a path I had never walked before. And so I sat there, letting the truth settle into my bones like cold water. I had been released, discarded, abandoned. Use whatever word comforts the witnesses, but I was still here, breathing, thinking, preparing. The catalyst had ended one version of me, but another was beginning to stir, slow and deliberate, like an animal waking after a long winter, unsure yet certain that survival was still a task worth attempting. The first quiet worsening did not come with raised voices or slammed doors or any dramatic gesture that could signal a turning point. Instead, it arrived through a slow, creeping shift in the rhythm of my days, the kind you do not notice while it is happening, but only when you sit still long enough to feel the weight of everything that has changed. The shelter had its own heartbeat. Morning medication rounds delivered with the bored precision of a factory line. Breakfasts that tasted of steam and resignation. Staff members rotating like clock hands, set slightly off schedule. And the murmuring undercurrent of dozens of displaced lives trying to negotiate a small sliver of existence in a place that was never meant to hold stories for long. I began waking before the lights came on, not because of insomnia, but because the silence that preceded the clatter and bustle held a certain clarity, a clarity that made me aware of how thoroughly the world had shrunk around me. I noticed quickly that I had become invisible in the way older women often do, not ignored with malice, but bypassed with the casual confidence of people who assume the elderly have nothing left to offer, no remaining texture to their identity, no capacity for reaction. Staff spoke around me, not to me. Residents glanced past me as if I were a piece of furniture placed for convenience rather than a person with a pulse and memory. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder than anyone's acknowledgement of my presence. When I walked down the hallway, conversations continued without pause. Arguments softened only when a staff member approached, and somewhere in the mix of voices and footsteps, I felt myself dissolving, as though the edges of me were being erased one slow stroke at a time. Small humiliations accumulated like dust in the corners of the room I shared with the unseen occupant, whose emerald scarf still sat folded neatly on the other bed. Once, a staff member misplaced my chart and asked 3 times for my name as if she had never seen me before. And when I reminded her gently that I had already been through intake, she apologized only with a distracted nod before moving on to another resident. Another time, a volunteer handing out donated toiletries gave me men's deodorant and a travel-sized razor with dull blades, and when I tried to exchange them for something more appropriate, she smiled with patronizing patience and said, "At your age, honey, does it really matter?" That sentence lodged itself under my skin more deeply than I expected, not because of the objects she gave me, but because of the assumption that I no longer deserved the dignity of preference. Meals became an exercise in pretending I was comfortable sitting among strangers who carried their own grief like heavy luggage and had no space left to recognize mine. A woman with trembling hands spilled soup onto her lap one evening, and when I helped her clean it, another resident muttered that I was trying too hard to be useful, as if kindness was a kind of currency I could no longer claim. The staff member supervising the meal didn't hear the comment or pretended not to, but I felt it echo through me, not as a wound, but as a confirmation of something I had feared long before arriving here. That once a woman is categorized as old, everything she does is interpreted through the lens of neediness or burden, never as autonomy or intention. Nights were the worst. The shelter grew louder as darkness settled, as though every sorrowful or agitated soul became restless when the lights dimmed. People argued about blankets that had gone missing, about whispered rumors of theft or favoritism among staff, about a man who had been taken to the hospital and wasn't expected to return. There were outbursts, quiet sobs muffled behind bathroom doors, and footsteps pacing the halls like aimless ghosts. I lay awake listening to it all, my mind turning the noise into stories of people who had once been children with birthdays and favorite songs and ambitions their families might have encouraged before something, illness, poverty, addiction, heartbreak, rendered them invisible long before age ever could. During those nights, I also began to notice a pattern. The staff grew colder as the hours stretched on. They were tired, overwhelmed, often young and inexperienced, carrying the lives of the broken with a weariness that made their patience thin and their compassion inconsistent. I watched them from my bed, their figures moving through the hallway behind the small window in our door, and sensed that part of the reason they overlooked me was because I did not demand anything loudly enough to force their attention. I was easy to ignore, quiet, polite, the kind of resident who didn't cause trouble, which in a place like this meant I didn't exist. The deterioration continued in subtle increments. My son stopped answering entirely, even when the liaison attempted a wellness check call on my behalf. My clothes, which I had folded neatly in the metal locker, disappeared one by one after mandatory laundry rounds, replaced with mismatched garments that smelled faintly of bleach and other people's lives. When I asked whether I could keep my personal cardigan, the soft navy one I had knitted years ago, one of the attendants shrugged and said it was probably mixed in with communal items now, a casual dismissal that felt like they had taken the last piece of warmth that belonged solely to me. Even my medication schedule became muddled. Pills arrived at inconsistent times, and when I mentioned the nausea I felt after one dosage change, the nurse on duty told me to give it time, without checking the chart or asking follow-up questions. Human dignity isn't taken all at once. It's shaved away in thin slices so barely noticeable at first that you learn to adjust your posture to accommodate the discomfort. But then one morning, as I walked into the dining area, I overheard two residents discussing a rumor that an elderly woman had passed away in one of the upper rooms during the night, and the staff had waited hours to notify anyone because they didn't want to disrupt the medication rounds. I didn't know the woman. They rarely told us names. But the idea of someone's final breath slipping unnoticed into the dim air of this building terrified me more profoundly than any abandonment ever could. It wasn't death I feared. It was the prospect of dying here without a single person knowing my name or caring enough to remember it for longer than the time it took to fill out a form. It was during this period of quiet erosion that my unnamed roommate finally returned. I remember hearing soft footsteps and the whisper of a cane tapping against the floor before I saw her. She entered the room like someone accustomed to being observed, even in places where no one bothered to look. Her hair, silver and pinned neatly, contrasted sharply with the heavy shadows under her eyes. And yet she held herself with a poise that seemed borrowed from a past life far outside these walls. She glanced at me only briefly before sitting on her bed, picking up that emerald scarf, with a sigh that did not sound fragile, but rather exhausted in a measured, expensive way. She did not introduce herself. She did not need to. There are people whose presence announces them without the support of language. Her arrival was not comforting. In fact, at first it deepened my sense of displacement, because she radiated a kind of history that didn't match the sterile sameness of the shelter. The staff spoke to her differently, more cautiously, almost deferentially, and I sensed immediately that she did not belong here any more than I did, except perhaps in the way fate sometimes tosses two unrelated objects into the same drawer, simply because there is no better place to put them. She set down her cane, removed her shoes with practiced elegance, and sat quietly as though measuring the air between us. I realized then that we were two women caught in the same net of neglect, but instead of making us companions, it made us mirrors, each reflecting the other's defeat with uncomfortable accuracy. Yet even with her presence, the days continued their downward slide. Staff avoided eye contact. The meals grew more tasteless. A new resident screamed in his sleep for 3 nights in a row until he was quietly moved somewhere no one discussed. The liaison informed me that they were still evaluating my long-term options, a phrase that felt like someone placing my life on a shelf to gather dust. I began keeping my few remaining belongings in my pillowcase, not out of paranoia, but because it was the only space no one else touched. I walked the hallways slowly, watching staff push past me as though I were a cardboard cutout in their peripheral vision, and each time they did, a little more of me peeled away. The escalation wasn't dramatic. It was the steady tightening of a noose I had not realized had been placed around my identity. But in that tightening, something unexpected began to stir. Not rebellion, not hope, but a kind of internal recalibration, a quiet recognition that if I was going to remain myself, I would have to learn how to live in the shadows without letting them absorb me completely. And so, the first escalation was not a fall, but a sinking, a slow descent into the undercurrents of invisibility that older women know far too intimately, a descent that would have swallowed me whole if not for the strange poised woman with the emerald scarf who, without saying a single word, reminded me that dignity is not always taken. Sometimes it simply waits to be reclaimed. I stepped into the shift so slowly I didn't even realize I had crossed a threshold until I looked back days later and understood that something inside me had clicked, not with the force of rebellion, but with the subtle precision of a lock, finally, remembering how to turn. It began with a morning that looked like any other. The same metallic rattle of breakfast trays, the same echo of footsteps that paced the hallway like restless weather, the same tired voices calling out last names with the indifference of people, reading a grocery list. But that morning, when I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed, I noticed the woman with the emerald scarf, my mysterious roommate, watching me with an expression not born of pity or scrutiny, but of recognition, as if she had been waiting for me to lift my head and finally meet the life I had been avoiding since the day my son abandoned me at the shelter's door. She introduced herself in a tone so soft it seemed to settle into the cracks of the room rather than drift through the air. "Ellen," she said, and the name fit her like silk fits a shoulder. Effortless, expensive, slightly dangerous in its simplicity. She did not smile. She did not offer her hand. She simply acknowledged me as though we were monarchs from forgotten kingdoms meeting in exile. There was something in her posture that resisted the indignities of the shelter with practiced determination, a quiet insistence that the world had not yet succeeded in stripping her of identity, no matter how aggressively it tried. Her scarf was draped across her lap, the fabric shimmering faintly in the dull light, a reminder that elegance can survive even the most brutal environments. She asked if I had slept, her voice deliberate and unhurried, and though the question was mundane, the way she asked it made it feel like an invitation to speak in full sentences again, after weeks of offering only nods and polite fragments. I told her the truth, that I had slept little, that the noise of the shelter seemed louder each night, that I sometimes feared losing my grip on the things that made me myself. She listened, truly listened, without interrupting or correcting or explaining, and when I finished, she tilted her head slightly and said, "There is nothing more dangerous to the spirit than being treated as though you are already gone." It was the first sentence I had heard in weeks that felt crafted for the ears of a thinking, feeling adult rather than a patient or a case file, and for the first time since arriving, I felt not invisible, but seen. As days passed, Ellen revealed herself not through dramatic confessions, but through the careful distribution of truths, quiet, polished, intentional. She was a widow of a man whose wealth had shaped entire industries, though she spoke of him not with affection or bitterness, but with a kind of private reverence reserved for ghosts who still occupy the space between memory and obligation. Her children, she admitted, had placed her here with the same clinical precision my son had used, though her family had cloaked their abandonment in a far more elaborate web of legal jargon and feigned concern. She explained it all without theatrics, simply laying out the facts like cards on a table, and I realized that her presence in this shelter was not the result of misfortune alone, but of a betrayal so meticulously constructed that it must have taken years to refine. The more she spoke, the more the walls of my own silence began to crack. I found myself telling her things I had not intended to say aloud, memories long folded and tucked away like old linens, how I had sacrificed decades of my life to a family that never fully understood the cost, how I had ignored early signs that my son's love was conditional, how I had convinced myself that if I just kept giving, kept smoothing edges, kept absorbing disappointments without complaint, everything would balance out someday. Ellen listened without offering trite comfort. Instead, she gave me small, sharp observations that cut through the fog of my self-blame, pointing out the patterns I had mistaken for loyalty, the forgiveness I had mislabeled as duty. One afternoon, as we sat in the common room surrounded by the muted chaos of dozens of lives unraveling at once, she leaned closer and said, "They expect you to disappear. That is why they chose this place. But there is a part of you that refuses to die on command." The sentence startled me, not for its content, but for its accuracy. It was the first time anyone had articulated the quiet resistance I had felt building inside me, that stubborn ember that refused to extinguish despite everything the world had done to snuff it out. I began to reclaim tiny territories of myself. I brushed my hair in the morning with intention rather than habit. I walked the hallways, not like a ghost, but like a woman exploring unfamiliar terrain. I asked the staff for my medication schedule instead of waiting passively. I even requested different meals on days when the menu seemed too heavy or bland. And while the staff often ignored these requests, the act of asking itself felt like a declaration. Ellen encouraged these small rebellions with a subtle nod or a quiet good, reminders that identity is rebuilt piece by piece, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of moments where we assert our right to exist. The true shift, however, happened not in conversation, but in the way I began to see myself reflected in Ellen's gaze. She did not look at me the way staff did, with professional distance, or the way other residents did, with distracted disinterest, but with a kind of clarity that suggested she saw not what I had become within these walls, but who I had been before them, and possibly who I could be afterward. It was a rare, unsettling gift to be recognized by someone who had no reason to pretend, no need to flatter, no investment in rewriting the truth. Her belief in my capacity for survival was not warm or nurturing. It was strategic, almost fierce, as though she were taking inventory of my strengths and preparing them for use. Perhaps that was why, when she suggested we take walks together in the small concrete courtyard behind the shelter, I agreed without hesitation. We walked slowly, two aging women tracing small circles in a space fenced in by chain link and neglect, and yet each step felt like a reclamation. She told me stories of places she had traveled, boardrooms she had walked into without bowing her head, decisions she had made with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone her age to have held once. I told her stories of my own life, not grand, not glamorous, but filled with quiet endurance, raising a son alone, managing households where affection and obligation often blurred, navigating grief with hands that never stopped working, even when the heart beneath them felt hollow. The more we walked, the more something inside me solidified. The shelter no longer felt like a tomb, but like a chrysalis, dark, confining, suffocating at times, but not necessarily the end. I did not yet know what I was transforming into, but I sensed the process had begun. Ellen's presence was not salvation. It was a mirror held at the right angle for the first time in years. And in that mirror, I saw a woman bruised but not broken, diminished but not erased, waiting not for rescue but for the moment she would choose her direction with clarity rather than fear. Everything changed the day she placed a folded slip of paper into my hand without explanation. I opened it only after returning to our room, expecting a note or perhaps some cryptic encouragement. Instead, it was a name and a phone number written in the steady, authoritative penmanship of someone accustomed to signing documents with consequences. She sat on her bed watching me with those sharp, discerning eyes and said quietly, "If you ever decide you are finished being forgotten, he will know what to do." I did not understand fully what she meant then, but I felt the shift ripple through me like a current. The middle had arrived, not a climax, not an escape, but a turning of the inner compass, a slow and deliberate redirection toward a future I had not dared to imagine. And for the first time since arriving at the shelter, I felt the unmistakable beginning of possibility. The pressure came back into my life, not as a sudden intrusion, but as a gradual tightening, a slow inward pull that began with small disturbances I tried to ignore and then grew into something that reawakened the old instinct women develop after a lifetime of being watched, judged, and managed by people who mistake control for love. It began the morning I found my name written incorrectly on the medication chart for the third time, a simple clerical error the nurse waved away with a tired apology. But the error made me pause, if only because it revealed how easily a person could lose her place in the world when the papers that defined her began to shift under someone else's hand. It wasn't fear I felt, but a strange alertness, a prickling awareness that someone somewhere had begun to take an interest not in my well-being, but in my absence, as though my silence had created a vacuum too tempting for the outside world to leave, untouched. I didn't mention it to Ellen right away, partly because she was already fighting her own bureaucratic battles, and partly because I didn't want to seem paranoid. But the feeling persisted over the next few days, growing stronger each time I overheard a staff member whisper about legal inquiries or status updates that had nothing to do with routine shelter operations. The shelter was a place where information drifted like smoke, thin and directionless, carrying hints of things residents were never supposed to hear, and though I didn't catch full sentences, I heard enough fragments to know that my name had begun appearing in conversations beyond these walls. When a social worker asked me, politely, cautiously, if I had any relatives likely to seek clarification about my circumstances, something inside me froze. Clarification. The word was too clean to cover what my son would truly want: control, documentation, leverage. That night, I dreamt of the house I once called home. The chipped blue paint on the back door, the creak of the floorboard near the pantry, the window overlooking the street where I used to wait for my son's return from school. And when I woke, the room around me felt even smaller, as though the walls had contracted while I slept. The dream was not sentimental. It was accusatory, as if the house itself were reminding me that I had left pieces of myself behind, in rooms now occupied by people who wanted the remnants of my life without the inconvenience of my presence. It was then that I saw the envelope slipped under our door, not handwritten, but stamped with the neat precision of official correspondence. I picked it up with trembling fingers and opened it, half expecting a summons or a notice of some legal maneuver I didn't yet have a name for. But it was a short letter from the shelter administration informing me that someone claiming familial authority had requested access to my location and well-being records. I felt my breath catch, not in fear, but in the cold realization that my son had begun to circle back into my life, not out of remorse or concern, but because he had discovered that abandoning me came with complications he hadn't anticipated. It was never me he wanted to reclaim. It was the paperwork, the rights, the remnants of whatever he thought he still owned. When I showed the letter to Ellen, she read it with a grim, controlled calm, the kind of composure only someone who had survived far worse betrayals could maintain. She set the letter down and told me, in that steady voice she used for truths that might hurt, that men like my son didn't come back for love. They came back for leverage. She said he was likely trying to secure whatever authority he believed he deserved over my life, and that he would not stop until he found a way to make it seem like concern, even when it was nothing of the sort. I didn't want to believe her, not because I doubted her intelligence, but because some stubborn part of me still wanted to cling to the faintest thread of hope that my son might feel something other than self-preservation. But the next morning, when I saw two men in suits speaking quietly with the shelter director near the front entrance, that thread snapped. I recognized the posture, the attire, the performative seriousness of men who slipped easily into roles of authority without ever having earned the moral right to them. When the director glanced in my direction, her expression tight and apologetic, I knew instinctively that those men were connected to my son, lawyers, advisors, or hired consultants whose job was to turn a mother into a problem to be solved. I returned to the room, trying to steady my thoughts, and found Ellen sitting with her cane resting across her knees, her gaze sharp and discerning. She didn't need to ask what was happening. She could read it in the way I held myself, in the stiffness of my shoulders, in the silence that clung to me like damp fabric. She told me, without hesitation, that I needed to prepare not for confrontation in the dramatic sense, but for the quiet, insidious kind that came disguised as concern. She explained how her own children had maneuvered her into this very shelter using similar strategies, legal filings framed as protective measures, signatures she was pressured into, evaluations she wasn't allowed to challenge. She said that once a family begins rewriting the narrative of an elder's life, the truth becomes irrelevant. Only their version survives in the paperwork. She took out the same slip of paper she had given me weeks earlier and placed it firmly into my hand again. "Call him," she said, meaning the lawyer she trusted, the one who had helped her see through the fog of manipulation that wealthy families craft around the elders they deem inconvenient. I hesitated, not because I didn't trust her, but because calling meant acknowledging that my son was capable of far more calculated cruelty than I had allowed myself to admit. Ellen sensed my hesitation and told me something I couldn't forget. Denial is a luxury no abandoned woman can afford. Later that afternoon, as I walked through the courtyard alone, trying to gather the courage to make the call, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the fence, someone who did not belong to the shelter, someone who carried himself with the impatient confidence of a man who believed he had the right to be anywhere. It was my son. He didn't call out to me. He didn't smile. He simply waited, his jaw tight, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, as though already preparing the speech he would deliver to justify whatever document he needed me to sign. I stopped several feet away, heart pounding, not from fear, but from a sudden surge of clarity. In that moment, I understood Ellen's warning completely. He wasn't here for me. He was here for the residue of my life. The legal traces, the rights, the assets, whatever remained after years of erasure. He approached me with a rehearsed softness, his voice low enough to mimic concern, his words dipped in false warmth. He spoke of my safety, of the chaos of the shelter, of the need to reestablish proper oversight for my own good. He tried to position himself as the responsible party, the caring son forced by circumstance to intervene. I listened without interrupting, but every sentence he delivered felt like another thread pulling me back toward a life I no longer recognized as mine. When he finally produced a folder from his coat, a stack of forms he claimed would help clarify my status, I saw the truth with the same sharpness Ellen must have seen in her own children. To him, I was paperwork in the shape of a woman. I refused to sign. I didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't crumble. I simply said no with the calm finality of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore everything to defend. His face changed in an instant, the concern evaporating like mist, replaced by irritation and something darker, entitlement. He told me I was being unreasonable, that I couldn't possibly understand the ramifications of refusing, that I was making choices that would harm the family. The word struck me with a cruel familiarity. Family. As though that word still had weight between us. I walked away without offering another explanation, and though he called after me, I didn't turn back. When I returned to the room, Ellen was waiting, her expression softer than I had ever seen it. I handed her the folded slip of paper, opened it, and dialed the number. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and unhurried. The voice of someone who had untangled enough lies in his lifetime to know precisely how to begin unraveling mine. And as I explained what had happened, as I listened to the steady reassurance of someone who believed my story without needing proof, I felt a strange shift inside me, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. The past had come to reclaim me, yes, but I was no longer the woman it had left behind. That night, long after the shelter quieted and the echoes of distant arguments faded into the stale air, I lay awake beside the faint shimmer of Ellen's scarf and realized that the world outside these walls had begun to close in, not to save me, but to contain me. Yet for the first time in years, I felt the slow, deliberate rise of a strength that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with truth. My son could twist papers, summon strangers in suits, and drape his motives in the language of responsibility, but he could not change the fact that I had begun to reclaim the narrative he had worked so hard to control. The pressure was building, tightening, circling, but it no longer frightened me. It sharpened me. It prepared me. And in that tightening, I felt the unmistakable pulse of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for surviving. I had always imagined that a climax, if it ever arrived at this late stage of my life, would be loud or explosive or somehow cinematic. But instead, it unfolded with a kind of stillness that felt almost ceremonial, as though the world had been holding its breath for months and was finally ready to exhale through me. It began on a morning that smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain-soaked pavement drifting in through the cracked window. A day no different from any other, except for the quiet steel in my chest that told me something irreversible was about to take shape. I sat on the edge of my bed, adjusting the hem of the cardigan I had borrowed days ago, feeling the thin wool between my fingers, and realized that I no longer trembled when I touched my own clothing, no longer waited for someone to tell me what to do next or what papers needed my signature. The lawyer Ellen had pointed me toward had been working quietly in the background, gathering documents, sending emails, building a structure of truth that my son could no longer bend or manipulate. And though I hadn't seen the progress with my own eyes, I felt it in the air around me, the way animals sense a shift in weather long before the first clouds form. When the shelter administrator knocked gently on our door and asked me to come to her office, I did not feel dread. I felt clarity. A strange, crystalline calm settled over me as I followed her down the hallway, past the residents murmuring to themselves, past the volunteers sorting mismatched donations, past the flickering light in the corridor that had never been replaced. The air held a faint metallic chill, and my footsteps sounded firmer than I remembered them being. She led me into her small office, bare walls, a metal file cabinet, a laminated poster about residents' rights no one ever bothered to read. And there, sitting on the opposite side of the desk, was my son. He did not look up immediately. He pretended to be engrossed in some paperwork laid out before him, as though my presence were an administrative inconvenience rather than the gravitational center of the conversation that had brought him there. When he finally lifted his gaze, I saw not guilt or affection or even anger, but calculation, the cold, assessing glint of a man who had already decided the conclusion before the discussion even began. He gestured for me to sit, not with respect, but with the bored impatience of someone offering a seat to a witness in a hearing he believed he controlled. I sat, folding my hands in my lap, feeling strangely anchored. He began speaking in the same polished tone he had used during his last visit, slipping into a manufactured concern so smoothly I might have believed it years ago. He talked about my well-being, about ensuring continuity of care, about legal ambiguities that had arisen during my stay at the facility. But beneath his soft phrasing was a sharpened intent, the unmistakable drive to retrieve what he believed belonged to him, not me, not my health, not my safety, but the residual power tied to my name, my history, and the house he had once called home. He slid a folder across the desk, the edges perfectly aligned, and told me it contained the necessary documents to restore clarity of authority. All I needed to do, he insisted, was sign a few simple pages. I opened the folder slowly, expecting to feel a tremor in my fingers, but instead I felt a profound steadiness as I read the first page, then the second, then the third. They were exactly what Ellen had warned me about: guardianship reassignment forms, medical decision transfers, statements declaring me unable to manage my own affairs. Each signature line was a trap disguised as a lifeline. I lifted my eyes and met his gaze directly, something I hadn't done in years, and asked him calmly why he had decided to proceed without consulting me. He blinked, surprised not by the question, but by the tone in which I asked it, a tone that didn't match the compliant mother he had grown used to. He began to answer, weaving justification into a narrative about responsibility and concern. But before he could finish, the administrator cleared her throat softly and handed me a second folder. This one bore the name of Ellen's lawyer. My son's expression tightened as he recognized the letterhead. I opened the folder and read the neatly typed statements inside, each one a precise, unwavering counterweight to the documents he had brought. The lawyer had filed a protective challenge against any attempt to alter my legal standing without my explicit, independent consent. Attached were copies of messages, timelines, and proof of my son's abandonment, including the very papers he had signed to relinquish me to state care. The administrator looked between us, her face neutral, but her posture subtly different, as though she finally understood the gravity of what had been unfolding behind her office doors. My son tried to speak, but the lawyer had anticipated him. In the folder was a notarized statement from me, written under guidance, but entirely in my own words, asserting my autonomy and rejecting any outside attempt to assume control over my life. Without my willing participation, the administrator confirmed that it had been reviewed and validated. The moment she said those words, something in my son's face broke. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the small tightening around his eyes, the slight quiver in his jaw, the collapse of a plan he had assumed would be effortless. He tried to recover quickly, insisting I had been misled, manipulated, confused, that I didn't understand the consequences of my choices. For a brief second, I saw the boy he used to be, the teenager who argued when he feared losing ground. But the man he had become swallowed that expression almost immediately. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, and told me I was making a mistake that would divide the family, as though there were still a family left to divide. I listened without looking away, letting him finish, letting him exhaust every tactic he had perfected over the years. And then, when the room fell silent, I closed the folder he had brought and pushed it gently back toward him. "No," I said, not harshly, not loudly, but with the finality that felt like a key turning inside a long-rusted lock. "I am not signing anything for you ever again." He stared at me, stunned, not because he had expected compassion, but because he had expected nothing inside me to resist. Something in that moment shifted permanently between us, a severing not born from anger, but from clarity. The administrator thanked him for coming and informed him politely that any further legal actions would need to proceed through formal channels. He opened his mouth as though to protest, but I stood before he could finish, walked past him, and left the room with my back straight and my breath steady. I didn't tremble, didn't hesitate, didn't look back. The act was not dramatic to the outside world, but inside me it was seismic. When I returned to the room, Ellen was sitting upright, her emerald scarf draped loosely around her shoulders. She looked at me with an expression that softened just slightly at the edges, a silent acknowledgement that she knew exactly what I had done. I told her what had happened, every detail, and when I finished, she nodded once and said, "Irreversible is the only way freedom ever works." I sat beside her, letting the weight of the moment settle into my bones, realizing that for the first time in my long, uneven life, I had acted not out of duty or love or fear, but out of truth, my truth. Later that evening, as the shelter lights dimmed and the usual chorus of restless voices filled the hallway. I sat awake, listening to the steady breath of the woman who had given me the tools to reclaim myself. I thought about the papers, the signatures, the calm in my voice as I refused, and I understood that something profound had shifted not just between my son and me, but within the architecture of my own identity. I had crossed the point of no return, willingly, deliberately, with eyes open. And in that choice, I felt the quiet thunder of liberation. The quiet after everything unraveled did not come as a reward or a relief, but as a kind of gentle vacancy, a spaciousness inside me where fear used to live, the way a house feels different once the last unwanted guest finally leaves and you can hear your own breath echo softly against the walls. The shelter seemed almost unfamiliar in those final weeks, not because it changed, but because I was no longer shrinking to fit inside it. I moved through the halls with a steadiness I hadn't known in years, no longer anticipating the sudden intrusions of legal demands or the heavy footsteps of people who believed they had the right to decide my future. The administrators treated me with a new, cautious respect, not because they had suddenly seen my worth, but because the paperwork now firmly declared what I had been trying to remember all along, that I was still the author of my life, not a footnote in someone else's convenience. And though my son never returned, never called, never attempted another confrontation, I felt no hollow ache, no yearning for what might have been. The absence he left behind was simply silence, and silence, I discovered, could be soothing when it was not sharpened by expectation. Ellen's health faltered as winter approached, her breath shallower each night, her steps slower and more deliberate, as though she were aware of time thinning around her and wished to move through it without waste. She spoke less, though when she did, her words carried the same precise weight they always had. And in those final days, she seemed more concerned with my future than her own dwindling strength. One evening, as the dim fluorescent lights cast soft shadows across her bed, she reached for my hand with surprising firmness and told me that every woman deserves at least one moment in her life where she stops apologizing for her own existence. She said I had found mine, and she wanted me to hold on to it long after she slipped out of this world. I didn't know then how close that moment was, but I felt the gravity of her words settle into me like a final instruction. When she died, she did so with the same calm dignity with which she had lived. No outburst, no struggle, just a slow exhale that left the room unbearably still. The staff covered her with a thin white sheet, but I folded her emerald scarf and placed it on her chest before they carried her away, a gesture that felt both ceremonial and deeply intimate, as though returning to her the color she had brought into my life. The shelter felt hollow without her, but not in a way that threatened to consume me. Rather, the space she left became a kind of quiet inheritance, a reminder that survival is not simply a matter of breath, but of choosing oneself, even when the world insists you have no right to do so. The days that followed happened with a gentle inevitability. The lawyer contacted me to confirm the final details of Ellen's will, and when he told me she had left everything to me, the savings, the modest house she had kept under a trust her children never found, the small investments that still bore her husband's name, I felt neither shock nor disbelief, but a deep, solemn sense of responsibility. It was not wealth she had given me, not truly. It was her faith in my ability to continue a life no longer shaped by abandonment. I moved into her house weeks later, a small sunlit place on a quiet street with a porch large enough for 2 chairs and a backyard that still held the withered remnants of a garden she must have tended years before her world collapsed into legal battles and betrayals. Living there felt like stepping into a memory someone had prepared for me long before I knew I would need it. The rooms were uncluttered, the furniture worn but welcoming, and though the house carried traces of her, books she had underlined, soft blankets folded carefully on a cedar chest, the faint lingering scent of a perfume that had probably been expensive decades ago, it did not feel haunted. It felt entrusted. Some mornings I made tea and carried it out to the porch, sitting there with the scarf draped loosely across my shoulders, watching the world move with the slow, steady rhythm of people who believed they had endless time. In those moments, I felt a quiet gratitude I didn't know how to articulate, not to any god or fate, but to life itself, for allowing me a second beginning long after I had resigned myself to an ending. My son called once, though I didn't recognize the number. His voice was taut, performing a version of concern I no longer had patience for. He asked where I was living now, whether I needed help, whether I had made any final decisions he should be aware of. His tone faltered when I answered with calm indifference, telling him that I was comfortable, safe, and no longer interested in revisiting the parts of our relationship that hinged on obligation rather than respect. He tried to protest, but I ended the call gently, politely, as though closing a book I had finally finished but did not wish to reread. The silence that followed felt cleaner than any reconciliation could have. Now, in the stillness of this house that is both a gift and a reclamation, I find myself thinking often of other women who stand on the edge of disappearance, who are pushed toward quiet corners of the world by people who cannot imagine them as anything but burdens. I wish I could gather them on this porch, wrap them in Ellen's emerald scarf, and tell them that survival is not always loud or heroic. Sometimes it is simply the act of refusing to let someone else dictate the terms of your fading. Sometimes it is saying no at the right moment. Sometimes it is trusting the hand that reaches toward you when you least expect it. And sometimes, if the world is strangely kind in its cruelty, it is finding a home, not because you were saved, but because you finally stepped out of the place where you were meant to disappear. I sit here now with the soft hum of late afternoon settling against the windows, and I know that my life, small and quiet as it is, belongs entirely to me again. The world may never understand the weight of that victory, but I do, and perhaps that is enough.